One day, the man returned home, but he was not alone. Walking beside him was a quiet child he had brought from distant lands, someone he intended to introduce as a younger brother. From the very first moment, however, the young man felt something strange about the child. There was something unsettling in the way the newcomer looked at him, something that made him wonder if the boy might be a little demon in disguise. He attempted to tell his father about his suspicions, but the supposed younger brother immediately began threatening him in subtle ways, as if warning him to stay silent. In the end, the young man chose to ignore the strange behavior. After all, such was the fate of an older brother, to overlook the mischief of the younger one and quietly cover it up. Meanwhile, the young girl who had recently entered their lives was busy correcting certain details in her older brother's diary in her own subtle way. The older brother had always written about her constantly, and although she had asked him to stop and to tighten the household security, he stubbornly continued. Still, when she glanced at the diary again, she could not help but smile faintly. Despite everything, she knew he cared for her deeply. Their household eventually descended into complete chaos. The confusion began when it was revealed that the youngest member of their family, Reuben, was actually a girl. But the story of how Reuben came to be part of their family began much earlier, on a battlefield soaked in blood. Some time ago, a weary warrior had been walking across the devastated land, searching for any survivors among the ruins. The war between humans and black magicians had lasted for 10 brutal years, leaving behind countless corpses and villages reduced to ashes. The battlefield had become a graveyard where silence ruled. Then suddenly he heard a faint sound. Turning toward the noise, the man instinctively raised his sword and pointed it forward, ready to strike. But when he looked closer, he froze. Standing among the mountain of corpses was a tiny child trembling with fear. The warrior, Duke Leviathan Seabert, was stunned. He had not expected to find a small, defenseless child in such a horrifying place. Slowly lowering his sword, he studied the boy carefully before speaking in a calm voice, assuring the child that there was no need to be afraid. The war, he explained, was finally over. The boy looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes and asked in a trembling voice if that was truly the case. Leviathan nodded gently. The war had ended at last. After 10 years of relentless fighting, the dark mage who had started the conflict had finally been defeated. The continent's greatest enemy had fallen, and the long nightmare was over. With a quiet sigh, the Duke lifted the small child into his arms. His voice carried a hint of sadness as he apologized for arriving too late to save the others. The boy was clearly exhausted, weak from hunger and thirst. Leviathan immediately instructed his companion to prepare water and food for the child, yet that night something strange happened. In his dream, the boy suddenly appeared and embraced him tightly, as if seeking comfort. When Leviathan woke up, he found the child looking embarrassed, apologizing softly for frightening him. The Duke stared at the boy in confusion, still unsure why the child's eyes seemed unusually large and expressive. He eventually asked the boy if he had any family, parents, siblings, or relatives who might still be alive. The boy quietly replied that he had no one left. Without hesitation, the child grabbed Leviathan's hand tightly, as if afraid he might disappear. The Duke was caught off guard by the sudden gesture, but after a moment he understood. The boy wanted to stay with him. Leviathan assumed the child must have suffered greatly if he was willing to trust a stranger so quickly. Still, he carefully explained that things would only be possible if the boy was not from the magical kingdom, a place so strictly closed that no one could leave without the king's highest permission. Later that evening they sat quietly by a small fire. Leviathan told the boy that once they returned to the Empire, he would find a proper shelter for him. At that moment, the child suddenly noticed the coat of arms embroidered on the Duke's clothes. Her eyes widened in shock. Only then did she realize who the man in front of her truly was. In the middle of that cursed battlefield, memories from her previous life, memories she had long tried to forget, suddenly returned. She realized that she had been reborn inside a novel she once read. The story described the long war between humans and a dark magician, and the hero who ultimately ended the conflict. That hero was standing right before her. Duke Leviathan Seabert. In the original story, Leviathan defeated the continent's most powerful dark mage despite possessing no magical power himself. His victory marked the dramatic finale of the first volume of the novel. But the second volume told a far darker tale. After the Duke's unexpected death, the king of the magical kingdom resurrected the dark mage. With Leviathan gone, the only man capable of stopping him, the sorcerer's power spread unchecked. The entire continent was once again plunged into chaos and war. Rubian felt a chill run through her body. The ending of the story had been disastrous, and she, merely an insignificant extra, would likely become one of its countless victims. She could not allow that future to happen. Determined, she looked at the Duke with a hopeful smile and asked if he might consider taking in a younger child as part of his family. The response she received was immediate and cold. Leviathan firmly refused. Rubian was completely stunned. She had not expected such a harsh rejection. The Duke explained that he would escort her only as far as the orphanage in the capital. Nothing more. Desperate, Rubian insisted again, practically begging to be accepted as the youngest member of his household. Leviathan sighed as he watched the stubborn child nearly throw herself onto the dusty ground in protest. The Duke could not understand why the boy suddenly cared so much about becoming someone's younger sibling. In truth, Rubian herself knew she had been too hasty. Asking for adoption only hours after meeting him was reckless. But after spending so long searching for him on the battlefield, she could not afford to miss this chance. The truth was that she did not even remember exactly how Leviathan would die in the future. Too much had happened since her rebirth, and the memories of the novel had grown blurry. In this life, she had been forced onto the battlefield as a child soldier by the magical kingdom. She was a young mage, barely old enough to understand war. When the Allied nations condemned the use of child soldiers, children like her were moved to the rear lines. But even there, survival was never guaranteed. After enduring a year near the front lines, she finally realized that this world was the same one from the novel she once read. Desperate to change the future, she deserted the army and set out to find Leviathan. The magical kingdom was extremely strict, and desertion meant certain punishment if she were caught. Even so, she evaded her pursuers again and again until she finally reached the battlefield where the Duke fought. Unfortunately, there was one major problem. Leviathan hated magicians because of an incident that had occurred 10 years ago. Rubian therefore had no choice but to hide her identity. As a deserter, a mage, and a former child soldier, revealing the truth would be disastrous. During their journey, the Duke began to notice how strangely the child behaved. He assumed the talkative companion walking beside him was a boy, and casually referred to him as such, leaving Rubian momentarily stunned. Changing her gender was something she had never planned, but correcting him now would only complicate things further. As they traveled, Leviathan protected the child from danger without hesitation. When monsters appeared along the borderlands, he dealt with them swiftly, often telling the boy to close his eyes so he would not have to witness the violence. Rubian obeyed, though she still complained when the monster's blood splashed onto her clothes. She even scolded the Duke for the mess, leaving Leviathan somewhat bewildered by her unusual reaction. He soon noticed something else strange. The child never cried. Even when frightened or exhausted, the boy remained calm. When Leviathan asked why, Rubian simply explained that crying would not solve anything. The Duke frowned slightly at that answer, and gently touched the child's nose, telling him that holding everything inside for too long could make a person sick. Despite their odd conversations, their journey continued peacefully. They spoke about many trivial things along the way, their likes and dislikes, silly jokes, and simple banter that filled the quiet road. Eventually they reached the capital. True to his word, Leviathan brought the child to a beautiful imperial orphanage. He admitted that he had enjoyed traveling together, but he still said farewell to the small, dirty boy without changing his decision. Rubian was furious. After everything she had done to reach him, he had abandoned her the moment they entered the capital. She wondered if asking to become his youngest family member had truly been such an outrageous request. But before she could dwell on her frustration for long, a sudden wave of dizziness struck her. The imperial capital had very little mana in the air, and simply existing in such a place drained her remaining magical energy. Her vision blurred as exhaustion washed over her. Just then, another child approached the newcomer with concern, noticing how pale and tired she looked. Rubian realized that her struggle in this new life had only just begun. Rubian lifted her head and looked at the boy standing before her. For a moment, she was genuinely surprised. The young man was unbelievably beautiful, the kind of person who seemed almost unreal at first glance. Despite his gentle appearance, she quickly shook off the thought and calmly explained that she was not sick. Her mind was simply overflowing with thoughts that demanded answers. The boy smiled warmly and offered to listen if something was troubling her. His tone carried a sincere kindness, as if he truly wished to help. Rubian hesitated. Deep inside, she knew the truth. She needed to save Duke Leviathan. Even though she had concealed her magical identity, she still believed the Duke was a scoundrel for abandoning her so mercilessly at the orphanage. Yet, despite that resentment, she also understood that she had to meet him again. If she failed to intervene, the future described in the novel might still unfold, and the Duke might fall to a tragic fate. The young man watched her carefully and noticed how strangely agitated she seemed. Curious, he gently asked what could possibly be troubling her so much. Rubian released a quiet sigh and brushed aside the concern, claiming that she was merely trying to overcome some childish fears from her past. The boy seemed surprised by such a response, clearly not expecting something so serious from someone who appeared so young. At that moment, the matron of the orphanage approached their table. She glanced at Rubian in surprise, noticing that the new child had already finished every bit of food placed in front of her. With a pleased smile, the woman remarked that since the meal was finished, it would be a good time to measure the child's mana. Rubian froze. The matron explained calmly that recent events had forced them to check everyone. A fugitive magician was currently being hunted, and authorities were investigating all possible hiding places, including orphanages. Therefore, every child would have their mana measured. The words struck Rubian like a thunderbolt. She immediately realized that this could expose her identity. If the inspection revealed her magic, her desertion from the magical kingdom would be discovered. While this quiet crisis unfolded at the orphanage, Duke Leviathan Seabert was attending an important meeting within the imperial palace. Across from him sat the Emperor Dietrich, who gazed out across the palace gardens with a relaxed smile. The land stretching beyond the palace walls appeared peaceful and limitless, as if the long years of war had never existed. Leviathan, however, had no interest in admiring scenery. His sharp gaze fixed on the Emperor as he bluntly requested that they dispense with pleasantries and discuss the real matter at hand. Dietrich eventually revealed the reason for the meeting. The magical kingdom had requested assistance in capturing a fugitive magician. Recently, a detachment of magicians traveling through a gorge had been completely wiped out, yet strangely, the body of one of them had never been recovered. Leviathan sighed heavily. In his mind, the missing magician had most likely fallen into an abyss during the chaos. He muttered that it seemed absurd for him to be expected to clean up the problems of magicians as well. The Emperor chuckled lightly and reminded his old friend to calm his temper. Leviathan's murderous aura had grown so intense that the palace attendants nearby looked as if they might collapse from fear. Dietrich knew perfectly well that Leviathan despised anything related to the magical kingdom. Still, the Emperor believed that completely ignoring the situation would be irresponsible. At those words, Leviathan's expression darkened. He coldly declared that he had no desire to hear anything further about the matter. The tension in the room instantly became suffocating. Several young attendants nearby lost their balance and fell to the ground, trembling in fear. The Emperor calmly reassured them that everything was fine and dismissed them. Once they had left, Dietrich mentioned another topic. He had heard an amusing rumor from the capital's officials. Apparently, someone had witnessed the terrifying Duke of the North behaving surprisingly gently toward a small child during his journey to the capital. With a teasing smile, the Emperor asked if Leviathan had been considering adoption again. Dietrich then added a more serious remark. The northern territories ruled by Leviathan were harsh and unforgiving. The cold climate and constant monster threats made it a place where even grown adults struggled to survive. It was hardly an environment suitable for a child. Leviathan understood the implication immediately. The Emperor was not simply teasing him. He was reminding him of the reality of the North. A fragile boy like Rubian would most likely suffer terribly there. For that reason, Leviathan had forced himself to leave the child at the orphanage. He could not selfishly drag the boy into such a cruel land. Even so, a lingering thought remained in his mind. Before leaving the capital, he still wanted to visit the boy one more time. Meanwhile, rumors had begun spreading throughout the city. Several women were discussing a shocking incident. Thieves had broken into the imperial orphanage. One of the children had been injured during the chaos. When Leviathan overheard the news, he froze instantly. A short time earlier, a frightening situation had unfolded near the shelter. Rubian was breathing heavily as she faced a violent thief. She had only used a small amount of magic to deal with the situation, but even that tiny effort had pushed her to the brink of exhaustion. Her original plan had been simple: escape through the restroom and avoid the manna inspection entirely. But before she could leave, another frightened child fainted after encountering the intruder. When the thief noticed Rubian, she had no choice but to act. Using magic had been unavoidable. Unfortunately, the effort drained the last of her strength. Her vision blurred as exhaustion overwhelmed her. At that moment, a frightening thought crept into her mind. She desperately wanted to find Leviathan and reveal the truth to him. But at the same time, she was terrified that he would abandon her again. A painful realization struck her heart. Perhaps no one in this world truly needed her. Shaking her head, Rubian tried to force away those foolish thoughts. She knew her condition was making her mind wander toward despair. What she needed now was not self-pity, but determination. Still, her body had reached its limit. While stumbling through an empty alley, Rubian finally collapsed to the ground. Sometime later, Leviathan arrived at the scene. One of his knights reported that a boy from the orphanage had been found unconscious but unharmed. The child was simply suffering from extreme exhaustion and would likely wake soon. Hearing this, Leviathan released a heavy breath of relief. A nearby knight quietly admitted that he had never seen the Duke so enraged over a single child before. Leviathan ignored the remark. His cold gaze swept across his subordinates as he ordered them to continue searching until the boy was found. After some time, they finally discovered a small figure lying motionless in a damp alleyway. The sight filled the Duke with burning anger and guilt. He realized that leaving the boy alone in the capital had placed him in danger. Rubian eventually opened her eyes. Confused and disoriented, she looked around quickly, trying to understand where she was. Leviathan's familiar voice soon reached her ears. She was in a temporary barracks, he explained, and the place was safe. The Duke studied her carefully and mentioned that she had fainted from exhaustion. He had already prepared food for her and even brought a fresh change of clothes. Rubian quickly checked herself in panic before realizing that only her outer jacket had been removed. Nothing else had been discovered. Leviathan then checked her body temperature and carefully examined her condition. Rubian stared at him in disbelief before quietly asking whether he had truly been searching for her. The Duke admitted that he had rushed to the orphanage the moment he heard about the robbery. When he learned the boy had gone missing, the fear he felt had been overwhelming. He also asked why the child had wandered into such a dangerous alley alone. Rubian immediately responded that if the Duke was so worried, he should simply keep her close to him. Leviathan smiled faintly and admitted that he had been considering something similar. Rubian froze, unable to believe what she had just heard. The Duke then casually told the child to finish eating first before asking further questions. Unable to restrain herself any longer, Rubian finally asked if he truly intended to take her with him. Leviathan explained his reasoning slowly. The world had finally achieved peace after 10 long years of war. He wanted the child to live safely somewhere warm, somewhere without monsters or harsh winters. But Rubian understood something he did not. A peaceful life was never meant for her. With unwavering determination, she declared that the safest place for her was by his side. Even if the north was cold and full of monsters, she would follow him. Leviathan looked at the stubborn child for a long moment before finally smiling. If that was truly the boy's decision, then he would accept it. Once Rubian recovered, they would return to the north together. Later, they began arranging the legal documents. Instead of immediate adoption, Leviathan chose to formalize guardianship first. Rubian accepted the arrangement without hesitation, secretly relieved. Her true goal was to protect him and eventually leave once the danger had passed. As she signed the documents, the Duke laughed softly at her terrible handwriting, joking that it looked as though it had been written by an earthworm. Rubian loudly protested that it was simply the imperial script. Soon afterward, they bid farewell to the lawyer and prepared for their journey. Leviathan reminded the boy that the North was a cruel and unforgiving land. If the child changed his mind after seeing it, there would still be time to reconsider everything. But Rubian had already made up her mind. She would stay by his side no matter what. Leviathan observed the determined child with a puzzled expression. He could not understand why the boy was so attached to him. Nevertheless, from that moment onward, Rubian became the youngest member of the Seabert household. Far away in the northern territories, an old man listened to the news with a dark expression. The Duke was bringing a child with him. The old man glared at his subordinate in irritation, muttering that his foolish son was doing something completely unnecessary. After a moment of thought, a cruel smile slowly spread across his face. If the child truly intended to survive in the north, then he would need to prove it. And the old man already had the perfect test prepared. After some time on the road, Rubian quietly asked the Duke for forgiveness. During the journey, she began to feel increasingly ill inside the carriage. The constant rocking made her stomach churn, and nausea rose in waves that left her pale and dizzy. She had not expected such a thing to happen in her previous life, and even during the harsh days on the battlefield, she had endured countless hardships, yet something as simple as traveling in a carriage had defeated her so easily. Leviathan noticed her condition immediately. Although his tone remained calm, his attention never left the child. He told her not to worry and encouraged her to drink water slowly so that the discomfort would ease. Rubian obediently followed his advice, though she remained puzzled by her own weakness. The Duke watched her for a moment before declaring that the situation would not do. If the carriage continued to shake like this, the child's condition might worsen. It seemed that they would need to change how they traveled. Before he could say more, Leon approached and respectfully called out to the Duke. Both Leviathan and Rubian turned toward the knight in mild confusion. Leon apologized for interrupting, but he had something important to suggest. Rubian observed him carefully. She knew who he was. In the original story, Leon had always been known as one of the Duke's most loyal knights, a man whose loyalty never wavered. However, judging by the way he looked at her now, she could clearly tell that he did not like her very much. Leon calmly proposed that the child should ride on his horse instead of staying in the carriage. Fresh air would prevent the motion from making her sick. At the same time, he pointed out something else, something far more important. The Duke needed rest. Rubian was startled by those words. Leon explained that Leviathan had barely slept since reaching the capital. Between escorting the child, dealing with matters in the palace, and then traveling without pause, the Duke had been pushing himself far beyond what was reasonable. Only then did Rubian realize the truth. Leviathan had lost sleep because of her. First he had rushed to find her after the orphanage incident, and afterward he had continued the journey without taking proper rest. Leviathan dismissed the concern with his usual stubbornness, claiming that his knight was exaggerating and that he was not tired at all. But Leon stared at him firmly and replied that even the strongest knight would collapse if he slept only a few hours for several days. The Duke quickly scolded his subordinate for saying such alarming things in front of a child. But Rubian had already understood everything. Without hesitation, she declared that she would ride with Leon instead. Before the Duke could protest, she grabbed the knight by the collar of his uniform and pulled herself closer. Then she turned toward Leviathan with a surprisingly intimidating expression and ordered him to go rest inside the carriage immediately. The Duke only smiled faintly at the child's commanding tone, insisting once again that he was perfectly fine. Rubian ignored him completely and reached toward Leon, asking the knight to help her climb onto the horse. She looked back at Leviathan and announced firmly that refusal would not be accepted. If he truly wished to protect his people, then he should begin by taking proper care of himself. Leviathan watched her with quiet amusement. He had already realized that arguing with this stubborn child would accomplish nothing. Not long after they continued their journey. Rubian now rode with Leon, while the Duke finally allowed himself to rest inside the carriage. From her position on the horse, she occasionally glanced toward the carriage window, confirming that he had finally fallen asleep. She sighed softly, wondering why he was so stubborn in the first place. Leon eventually broke the silence. In a stern tone, he informed the boy that speaking to the Duke in such a manner was disrespectful. No matter the circumstances, proper respect should always be shown. He then asked a question that had clearly been on his mind since the beginning. Why did the child insist on following their Duke? Rubian answered simply that it was because Leviathan had picked her up in the first place. Leon sighed deeply at that response. The boy clearly did not understand what kind of life awaited him. The North was not a peaceful land where children could grow up happily. It was a harsh frontier constantly threatened by monsters. Creatures that had once been driven away still attempted to reclaim their territories, attacking the borders again and again. In the North, the battles never truly ended. It was far from the paradise the boy might have imagined. Rubian listened carefully, though she initially thought Leon was simply exaggerating. However, the more she considered his words, the more she realized how dangerous the Duke's homeland truly was. Leviathan had spent his entire life fighting monsters in that frozen land. Even after that, he had gone on to spend 10 years on the battlefield during the war against the Dark Magician. For someone who had endured so much to die afterward, it was simply too cruel. With sudden determination, Rubian loudly declared that there was no need for anyone to worry about her. She wanted to try. But her declaration was interrupted by a strange sound beside her. Leon suddenly leaned forward, his body trembling as pain shot through him. Rubian looked at him in shock. His face had grown pale, and sweat covered his forehead as if he were struggling to endure something unbearable. Despite this, Leon insisted that he was fine and urged them to continue the journey. Leviathan immediately rejected that idea. He ordered the group to set up camp and rest before traveling any further. The Duke then turned toward Leon with a stern expression, demanding to know why he had hidden the true severity of his injury. Concealing such information was a direct violation of military discipline. Leon admitted quietly that he simply did not want to inconvenience the rest of the squad. Rubian watched the scene closely before speaking up. The war was already over, she reminded him. There was no longer any need to endure pain while rushing toward another battlefield. They were not marching to war, they were returning home. The words came out before she could stop herself, and she felt slightly embarrassed afterward. However, Leon only sighed and acknowledged that the child was right. The war truly had ended. Leviathan smiled faintly as well. They had finally finished that long struggle. Now that they were returning home as heroes, the Duke added, they needed to make sure they survived the journey. Otherwise, all their sacrifices would have been meaningless. Rubian watched the two men quietly, feeling strangely moved by the moment. Later, when Leon's wound was being treated, Rubian quickly retreated from the tent because of the strong smell of the ointment being used. She could hardly understand how they could tolerate something that smelled so terrible. Leviathan noticed her reaction and asked why she had suddenly run away. Rubian bluntly replied that the medicine stank. The Duke simply laughed and told her that if she wished to become a knight someday, she would have to learn to endure such things. That night, while the camp rested and the Duke attended a meeting with his officers, Rubian did not waste her time. She remembered that medicines in the magical kingdom were far more advanced than the crude mixtures used here. Quietly working in a corner of the camp, she began preparing her own ointment. Using the base medicine provided by the knights, she carefully improved it by adding finely chopped herbs she had gathered nearby. Her hands moved skillfully as she completed the mixture. When she finished, Rubian smiled in satisfaction. The new ointment had no unpleasant smell, and its healing effect was much stronger. Just as she was admiring her work, a familiar presence suddenly appeared. Rubian froze in shock when she heard the voice calling out to her. It was Khalid. During the war, she had once encountered him in a cave where he had been captured and left bound by enemies. Unable to ignore someone in distress, she had freed him. In return, the young mage had sworn an oath of loyalty to her. A mage's oath was not something simple. It bound their mana together like invisible chains, allowing them to sense each other's presence no matter the distance. Khalid explained that he had been unable to find her for a long time because her sudden disappearance had severed the flow of mana between them. He admitted that it had worried him greatly. Rubian apologized sincerely. She had rushed off in her determination to find the Duke and had not considered how it would affect him. Khalid quickly brushed aside the apology and asked if she was currently in Babylon, the capital of the empire. Rubian was startled that he knew her location. Khalid simply smiled and explained that he could sense her fear through their connection. Then, without hesitation, he declared that he would come to her soon. Rubian was shocked by the decision. The journey to reach her would be extremely long and dangerous. The following day, Rubian presented Leon with a small gift, the improved ointment she had prepared. She casually explained that the original medicine smelled unbearable, so she had mixed it with herbs to make it better. Leon stared at her in disbelief. He had not expected such words from a small boy. Still, he accepted the gift and thanked her sincerely, even apologizing for his earlier harsh attitude. Then, to Rubian's complete surprise, Leon knelt before her and told her to address him properly as Sir. She looked at him in confusion, unable to understand why he suddenly acted so respectfully. Leviathan watched the scene with amusement. Leon explained that if the boy intended to live in the Northern Territories, he would eventually become part of the Northern Knights. Rubian felt slightly conflicted by the statement. She imagined the powerful knights of the North, yet she knew the truth. She was not a knight at all, but a magician. Leviathan then opened the small box containing the ointment and examined it with curiosity. He asked how the child had learned such a recipe, since randomly mixing herbs rarely improved medicine. Rubian lied without hesitation, claiming that her mother had been a healer and that she had learned by watching her work. The knights were astonished. They wondered if the child also understood wild herbs. Before long, they began praising her as a genius. Leon quickly snatched the ointment back, reminding everyone that it had been a gift meant specifically for him. The improved medicine soon became extremely popular among the knights. During the rest of the journey, the soldiers even prepared a larger carriage with wide windows for Rubian so she would no longer suffer from motion sickness. Thanks to this, the remaining days of travel passed smoothly. Eventually, the group reached the northern territories. Rubian looked out across the landscape with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Endless plains stretched beneath a blanket of snow. In the distance, massive mountains rose like silent giants. The land appeared empty, as if no human life existed there. She could not help but sigh and wonder if they had somehow arrived in hell itself. Leviathan looked at her in confusion and asked what she was talking about. To him, this frozen wilderness was simply his home. Rubian continued staring at the barren mountains and deep canyons where eerie animal cries echoed across the wind. During winter, the snow could pile higher than a man. It was far harsher than she had imagined. Leviathan asked whether she already regretted coming. Rubian quickly shook her head and insisted that nothing could frighten her. The Duke smiled at that brave answer, though the surrounding knights began laughing quietly at the child's dramatic declaration. Soon afterward, they arrived at the Duke's fortress. Rubian could not take her eyes off the massive structure towering before them. The fortress was both beautiful and intimidating, a symbol of the Seabert family's power in the north. She knew from the original story that the former Duke, Leviathan's father, Balrog Seabert, lived there as well. After suffering serious injuries on the battlefield, he had abandoned his position and withdrawn into the fortress, rarely appearing in public ever again. And now, Rubian was about to step into the very place where the story of the Seabert family truly began. At that time, the Duchess and her eldest son were staying in the southern territories. Because of this, only 2 members of the Seabert family remained in the northern fortress, the former Duke and Leviathan's second son, Boyd. After the long journey, Leviathan and his companions finally entered the massive castle that dominated the snowy landscape. As soon as they stepped inside, the servants gathered to greet their lord with respectful bows. Rubian looked around in amazement. The atmosphere of the fortress was both imposing and ancient. She soon learned that many of the servants had served the Seabert family for generations. Some families had remained loyal to the household for centuries. She studied the people surrounding them carefully. Their appearances were striking in a way she had not expected. Living in such a harsh environment had clearly shaped them. Even the maids looked unusually strong, their physiques far more robust than the delicate servants she had seen in the capital. The butler stepped forward and greeted Leviathan with a polite smile, remarking that the Duke must be tired after such a long journey. Then his attention shifted to the small child standing beside him. Leviathan calmly introduced Rubian, mentioning that he had already written about the boy in a letter sent ahead of their arrival. Rubian suddenly felt every pair of eyes in the hall turn toward her. The intense gazes made her instinctively hide behind the Duke's tall figure. To her, the servants' expressions felt strangely predatory, as if they were observing an unfamiliar creature. Still, she quickly gathered her composure. Stepping forward, she politely greeted everyone and introduced herself, adding that she hoped to get along with them. Her formal greeting left the entire room stunned. The servants had not expected such a polite and composed introduction from someone who looked so small. At the same time, they could not help noticing how charming the child appeared. Leviathan suddenly lifted Rubian into his arms. He looked down at the child with amusement and asked why she was trembling. Perhaps she was embarrassed by all the attention. Rubian immediately protested. She insisted that she was not weak at all. Although she had deliberately lowered the age she claimed to be in order to appear harmless, the truth was that she was already 10 years old. When the servants heard that, they stared at her in shock. Everyone had assumed the boy was only 6. Rubian was completely confused by their reaction. Leviathan simply smiled and jokingly warned everyone that they needed to be careful because the baby might bite. Rubian shouted angrily for him to put her down immediately. At that exact moment, a loud voice echoed from above. Everyone turned toward the staircase just in time to see a boy leap down from the 2nd floor. He spun through the air in a graceful somersault before landing lightly on the ground. The young boy ran toward Leviathan with an excited grin, declaring how long it had been since they had seen each other. Rubian watched him closely, and quickly realized who he was. Boyd Seabert. He was the Duke's second son. For a brief moment, the two children stared at each other silently. Then Leviathan called out to his son, breaking the strange tension. Boyd quickly apologized for his dramatic entrance, admitting that he had gotten carried away with excitement. Leviathan waved the apology aside. Instead, he looked at Boyd carefully and remarked with a smile that his son had grown quite a lot. Boyd seemed slightly embarrassed, but quickly began speaking again, eagerly telling his father that he had studied well and trained diligently. Leviathan nodded approvingly. Boyd's attention soon shifted to the unfamiliar child beside his father. He studied Rubian with curiosity and asked if the newcomer would be staying with them. Rubian greeted him politely, though she could not hide her surprise. In the original story, Boyd had been an orphan whose parents died during the war. Leviathan and his wife had adopted him, making him the second son of the Seabert family. Despite his tragic past, Boyd possessed a bright and cheerful personality. Rubian introduced herself, and Boyd responded with a friendly smile, proudly announcing that he was 11 years old. Then he asked her age. Rubian answered that she was 8. Boyd immediately burst into excitement when he realized she was younger than him. For the first time, someone in the castle was younger than he was. He happily declared that Rubian was now his junior. Rubian sighed deeply at being labeled that way. Boyd enthusiastically welcomed her to the family and even began calling her baby. He excitedly declared that he finally had a little friend and that he would carry his younger sibling around everywhere. Before the chaos could continue, the butler quietly informed Leviathan that the former duke was unable to come greet them due to illness. Leviathan sighed slightly and said he would introduce the child to his father later. Boyd then asked whether his father would be heading to his office. When Leviathan confirmed it, Boyd immediately asked if he could come along. The Duke agreed. Boyd happily lifted Rubian into his arms as if she weighed nothing. However, Leviathan quickly told him to put his younger sibling back down. Boyd excitedly promised to show his father his highest test scores and all the records from his fencing training. He also shouted that he would play with the baby later. The butler watched the scene with quiet satisfaction, commenting that the two young masters seemed to have quickly found common ground. Leviathan responded that it was only natural. They were family. The butler then added something interesting. When Boyd was younger, he used to cry whenever he saw Leviathan. The Duke's fierce appearance and overwhelming aura had frightened the boy terribly. Because of that, Leviathan had deliberately limited their meetings. But now, things had clearly changed. Rubian looked at the Duke thoughtfully and admitted that she could understand the reason. His face truly was a little frightening. Leviathan looked genuinely surprised by that comment. Before he could respond, Rubian suddenly pushed him away to stop him from pinching her cheek. He laughed softly, remarking that the child behaved like a wild animal. At that moment, the butler politely interrupted again. Someone wished to meet Rubian. A maid approached with a warm smile and introduced herself as Hazel, the child's personal maid. Seeing how exhausted Rubian must be after the journey, Hazel suggested that the young master take a bath. Rubian immediately became restless. She had not bathed properly for a long time, and the thought of soaking in warm water was extremely tempting. But if the maid assisted her too closely, her secret would inevitably be revealed. Leviathan noticed her hesitation and asked if something was wrong. Perhaps the boy's body was hurting again. Rubian quickly denied it. Instead, she shyly asked if she could whisper something to him. Leaning close to the Duke, she quietly explained that she had a large scar on her body and did not want anyone to see it. For that reason, she asked to bathe alone. Leviathan's expression darkened slightly when he heard about the scar. However, he soon nodded and instructed Hazel to prepare the bath while respecting the child's wishes. The servants were to help only if Rubian allowed it, and under no circumstances were they to pressure the child. Hazel agreed immediately and guided Rubian toward her room. After they left, the butler looked at Leviathan in surprise. He had never seen a child speak so freely with the Duke before, but his surprise quickly turned to unease when he noticed the dangerous expression that had appeared on Leviathan's face. Meanwhile, Rubian stood quietly in the bathroom, staring at the small scar on her body. She could not remember exactly how she had received it, but that was not the real problem. If anyone saw the magical brand on her back, it would immediately reveal that she was a runaway mage. Fortunately, the northern lands were once the territory of magical beasts. Because of this, mana was far more abundant here than in the capital. When she was certain she was alone, Rubian began her plan. She carefully formed a magic circle, allowing her own mana to resonate with the natural mana in the environment. By drawing energy from the surroundings, she compensated for her own depleted reserves. Moments later, she cast the spell. The magical brand on her back slowly vanished. When she looked into the mirror, she noticed that even the color of her eyes had returned to their original shade. Turning around, she confirmed that the mark was completely hidden. Rubian smiled with quiet satisfaction. It had been a long time since she used magic properly. Later, Hazel asked if the young master had enjoyed the bath. Rubian happily replied that she had, explaining that she had not bathed in a long time. Hazel smiled and remarked that in the cold northern lands, nothing was more comforting than warm water. Soon she noticed that the clothes Rubian was wearing were far too large. The maid immediately suggested making new clothes for her. Rubian quickly protested, insisting that it was unnecessary and that she could simply roll up the sleeves. Hazel only laughed softly, finding the boy's stubbornness adorable. A short time later, Hazel informed her that the cook had prepared special dishes. However, Rubian would be eating dinner alone, with her older brother. The moment she heard that, Rubian realized an opportunity had arrived much sooner than she expected. Boyd Seabert was known to be a brave and strong boy. Winning his trust would be extremely valuable. Yet when she arrived at the dining table, Boyd was already enthusiastically cutting her food into smaller pieces. Rubian quickly insisted that she could handle everything herself. Boyd only laughed, explaining that being an older brother was a difficult responsibility. Rubian soon realized that there was no need to conquer him at all. Boyd had already accepted her completely. Still, she obediently allowed him to fuss over her since resisting would require unnecessary effort. While eating, she asked why they were dining alone and where their uncle was. Boyd explained casually that his father was always busy and rarely joined them for meals. Rubian was surprised by this answer. She expected Boyd to be upset, yet the boy seemed completely accustomed to eating alone. For someone his age, that loneliness should have been painful. Watching him carefully, Rubian wondered whether she should act now. With a small smile, she mentioned that she had brought something from the capital. She had prepared a gift for her older brother. Boyd froze for a moment in disbelief. Then he suddenly jumped up from his chair, staring at Rubian with wide, excited eyes as he eagerly demanded to know what she meant. Rubian hurried toward his older brother, his eyes widening with surprise and excitement the moment he saw what Boyd was holding. In Boyd's hands was a small stack of limited edition hero cards, the kind every child dreamed of collecting, each one depicting famous military heroes of the kingdom. They were rare items that were usually sold out almost immediately. Rubian stared at them in disbelief. He could hardly believe that such valuable cards were in front of him. With genuine shock, he asked Boyd if those cards had truly been given to him. After all, they were not ordinary toys, but treasured collectibles. The young lady who had arranged the gift quickly reassured him that they were indeed meant for him. She had known all along that playing cards like these were the best gift for children. When they had visited the imperial market in the capital earlier, she had confidently announced that she needed some money to buy something. The Duke had been surprised by her boldness. He did not expect someone so young to ask him so directly for money. However, what puzzled him even more was the reason behind the request. To him, they appeared to be nothing more than simple cards, cheap toys meant for children. At that moment, the young lady had corrected him with enthusiasm. These were not cheap cards at all, but collectible hero cards that displayed the portraits of famous warriors who had served the kingdom. Hearing that explanation, she had been delighted. She remembered clearly that in the original story, the boy had desperately wanted these cards, but had given up because they were released in very limited numbers. She had not planned to use them the way he expected, yet she was still happy to see that he liked the gift so much. Rubian looked at Boyd with a bright smile. Seeing his older brother smile back made him feel strangely warm inside. Boyd seemed far more relaxed and cheerful when he smiled, and Rubian quietly thought that it suited him much better than the serious expression he often wore. Some time later, the young lady woke up from sleep. She had fallen asleep in a rather unusual position, and it took her a few moments to regain her senses. When she finally opened her eyes fully, she felt as if she had rested well. Standing nearby was the Duke, who watched the boy with a small smile. From the outside, it was obvious that Rubian had slept peacefully. The Duke greeted him calmly. Rubian was startled by his sudden presence. The surprise made his heart jump for a moment and confusion quickly followed. She could not understand why the Duke was standing inside her room so early in the morning. The Duke simply told her to put on her slippers, but Rubian refused to let the matter pass so easily. She wanted to know why he had come. Rubian knew that the Duke had only recently returned to the estate and must have been extremely busy. That was precisely why his presence here seemed so strange. However, the Duke did not immediately answer the question. Instead, he casually remarked that Rubian looked well and that nothing else was particularly important. After saying this, he seemed ready to leave as quickly as possible. Rubian offered to have breakfast together, but the Duke declined, explaining that he still had business to attend to. She hesitated before asking whether it was because he did not want to eat together with Boyd. The Duke looked genuinely surprised by the question. He denied it immediately, clearly confused about how such an idea had appeared in the first place. Rubian only sighed softly and said that she understood, even though she clearly did not look convinced. As the Duke prepared to leave, he added that once he finished his work, they would have a meal together. When the Duke finally left the room, he let out a quiet sigh. At the very least, he felt relieved that the boy had slept well that night. It had been Rubian's first night in an unfamiliar place, and he had been worried about him. During the long journey from the capital to the northern estate, Rubian had barely slept at all. More than once, the Duke had noticed the small boy tossing and turning in his sleep, his body covered in cold sweat. Even the hardened knights traveling with them had been disturbed by the sight. Rubian would mutter softly in his sleep, his brow furrowed as if he were reliving something unpleasant. The Duke suspected that the boy did not even realize he was having nightmares. During the day, Rubian always behaved cheerfully and brightly, smiling as if nothing troubled him. Because of that, no one had dared to ask him about his dreams. Sometimes the Duke wondered whether Rubian was dreaming about the attack on his home village. The way the boy tossed restlessly in his sleep reminded him of soldiers who had survived brutal battles. Those thoughts vanished when the butler approached him with an important matter. The Duke rubbed his temple and sighed again, feeling as though the amount of work he had to deal with was making his head spin. Perhaps that was why strange thoughts kept appearing in his mind. The truth was that he knew almost nothing about Rubian. Even after adopting him, the Duke still did not know how to properly communicate with his new son. In his own mind, he sometimes felt that there was no worse father than himself. At that moment, the butler informed him that a letter had arrived from the Duchess. The Duke's expression softened slightly. Before leaving the capital, he had written to his wife, asking whether she would mind if he brought a child home. It seemed that her reply had arrived just in time. The letter stated that she agreed with his decision. However, she also wished to hear the entire story once she returned home. The butler commented that her reaction was understandable, since the Duke had personally brought the child to the estate for the first time. When the Duke asked when his wife would return, the butler answered that it would likely take about a month. According to the letter, the Duchess had also jokingly expressed her hope that the Duke had not accidentally brought a girl home. Meanwhile, Boyd sat happily in another part of the estate, examining his own limited edition card. Among the many cards he had received, his favorite one displayed the image of his father. To him, that card was the best of them all. Excited, Boyd rushed toward Rubian's room, hoping to play together with his younger brother. However, the moment he opened the door, he froze in shock. Without hesitation, Boyd dropped all the cards in his hands and rushed forward. He placed himself protectively in front of Rubian and demanded to know what the maid was doing. The servant stared at him in confusion, unable to understand why he was suddenly so angry. Boyd insisted that they had frightened his younger brother. The maid nervously explained that she had done nothing wrong. She had only wanted to tidy Rubian's hair. But Boyd refused to accept that explanation. From his perspective, it was obvious that Rubian was trembling in fear. At that exact moment, the Duke entered the room and asked what was happening. Boyd immediately began explaining the situation with great intensity. However, Rubian quickly insisted that everything was fine. Boyd still argued that it was not fine at all. He had clearly seen his brother trembling the moment he noticed the scissors in the maid's hands. The Duke was surprised by this revelation. He immediately ordered the maid to put the scissors down. The maid turned pale and began trembling in fear. Soon afterward, the servants knelt down and apologized repeatedly for not realizing that the young lord might be afraid of scissors. Rubian was completely confused. In truth, she had not even realized that she was afraid of them herself. The reaction had been instinctive, something she had not expected. The Duke smiled faintly and praised Boyd for protecting his younger brother so quickly. Boyd proudly declared that he had simply fulfilled his duty as the older brother. Although the Duke cast a stern glance at the maids, Rubian asked him not to scold them. The Duke eventually allowed them to go, warning that such carelessness would not be forgiven again. With a gentle expression, the Duke then assured Rubian that he could cut his hair whenever he wanted. No one would force him to do something he disliked, not even the Duke himself. Rubian smiled and explained that his bangs had grown long enough to cover his eyes. Perhaps a small hair clip would be enough to keep them out of the way. Hearing this, one of the maids immediately volunteered to buy one. Instead, the Duke lightly brushed Rubian's hair aside and mentioned that there might already be something suitable in the Eastern Room. The suggestion left everyone surprised. The Duke then instructed the servants to retrieve the keys from the butler and search the room. Rubian looked around in confusion, having no idea what room they were talking about. Boyd soon returned to his usual cheerful self and asked whether Rubian felt better, noticing that his face looked pale. Rubian reassured him that everything was fine. A moment later, the Duke suddenly asked Boyd whether it was time for his fencing lesson. Boyd immediately realized that he had completely forgotten about it and rushed out of the room at full speed. The Duke watched him leave in astonishment. He had only asked a simple question, yet his son had jumped up and disappeared instantly. Later, the maids gathered together and reflected on what had happened. One of them burst into tears, claiming that she was not worthy of being a maid if she could not even notice when the young lord was frightened. Despite the incident, they all agreed on one thing. Rubian had shown kindness to them, and because of that, they felt a strong desire to protect him. To them, the boy seemed incredibly gentle and sweet, almost like an angel. For some reason, however, they occasionally imagined how he might look if he were dressed in girls' clothing. Eventually, the maids arrived at the Eastern Room. Inside, they discovered beautiful dresses, toys, and various delicate accessories clearly meant for a young girl. Among them were several elegant hairpins. They realized that these items had been prepared long ago for a daughter the Duke once expected to have. 10 years earlier, a tragic incident had occurred. A fleeing magician had been found injured by the Duchess along the roadside. Feeling pity for him, the kind-hearted Duchess had allowed him to travel with her. But when they reached a deep gorge, the man suddenly turned on her and attacked. The Duchess survived, but she suffered terrible injuries and lost the child she had been carrying. Since that day, the Duke's family had despised magicians with all their hearts. When the maids finally returned with one of the hairpins, they looked at Rubian with admiration. The accessory suited him surprisingly well. Rubian assumed that these items had once been prepared for the Duke's unborn daughter. She was unsure whether it was truly appropriate for her to use them. The Duke studied Rubian carefully for a moment. The boy grew nervous under his gaze, waiting silently for his decision. At last, the Duke smiled and said that the hairpin suited him perfectly. Rubian could keep it. Relief washed over her, though embarrassment quickly followed. She lowered her head slightly, reminding herself that her secret must never be revealed. After all, she was not truly a boy. Rubian was both a girl and a magician. A short while later, the Duke suddenly asked whether the scissors earlier had frightened him. Rubian was caught off guard by the question and looked at him in surprise. When the Duke repeated the question, she finally admitted that it was not exactly the scissors themselves that had frightened her the most. Rubian quickly explained that what had frightened her earlier was not the scissors themselves. What had truly startled her was the feeling of a stranger holding something sharp so close to her neck. She spoke hastily, trying to make it sound like a simple misunderstanding. The maids looked at one another in surprise. None of them had expected such an explanation. Rubian noticed their confused expressions and tried to clarify that it was not connected to any painful memories. She insisted that it was simply the discomfort of having an unfamiliar person standing so close with blades in hand. The Duke listened quietly while watching her carefully. His sharp gaze made her a little uneasy, yet she maintained a calm expression and added that perhaps she would feel more comfortable once she became accustomed to the castle and the people who lived there. After a brief silence, the Duke suddenly asked whether the hair at the back of her head was bothering her. Rubian blinked in surprise. She had not even thought about it before, but once he mentioned it, she realized that it did feel slightly uncomfortable. Leviathan smiled faintly and suggested that he could cut her hair himself. If strangers made her nervous, then perhaps she would feel calmer if it was done by someone she already knew. Rubian stared at him carefully. The Duke certainly carried himself with great confidence, and there was no doubt that he was skilled with weapons and sharp objects. However, cutting hair was something entirely different. She immediately protested. declaring that she would never allow someone without experience to experiment on her head. The two argued briefly, though the Duke appeared more amused than offended by her complaints. Eventually, after some hesitation, Rubian gave in. She agreed that he could try cutting her hair, but only if he listened carefully to the instructions of the maids. The Duke smiled as if he had just won an unexpected victory. With a hint of playful authority, he reminded everyone that he was technically their master. Hazel, however, quickly stepped forward and declared that she would guide him through the process step by step. Soon afterward, the strange scene began. The powerful Duke of the estate was surrounded by several anxious maids, while Rubian sat patiently waiting for her haircut. The maids watched every movement with nervous eyes, ready to correct him at the slightest mistake. As time passed, something unexpected happened. Rubian slowly relaxed. The steady rhythm of the scissors and the warmth of the Duke's presence made her eyelids grow heavy. Without realizing it, she eventually fell asleep. Some time later, Rubian woke up and wiped the drool from her mouth in embarrassment. She asked when she had fallen asleep. The Duke silently handed her a mirror. Rubian looked at her reflection and blinked in surprise. The result was far better than she had expected. She smiled and jokingly remarked that he had done impressive work and might even have a future career as a hairdresser. Hearing this, the Duke suddenly leaned closer and lightly bit a strand of her hair. Rubian jumped in shock and quickly moved away from him, unable to understand what he had just done. The Duke sighed with mild disappointment and commented that her hair had not melted after all. Rubian protested loudly, insisting that her hair was not cotton candy, but before she could complain further, the Duke easily lifted her up in his arms. He pressed a gentle kiss against her head and remarked that her hair was very cute. Rubian was once again stunned by his unpredictable behavior. Not long afterward, Boyd watched his younger sibling from a distance with slight bewilderment. For a brief moment, he even wondered whether Rubian might be some kind of fairy. Later, during breakfast preparations, Rubian asked the maids whether the Duke would once again skip the meal with them. They explained that the Lord had many important documents to review. Boyd smiled faintly and commented that their father would probably remain busy for quite some time. He invited Rubian to begin eating, but she suddenly excused herself and said she needed to go to the bathroom. As she walked through the hallway, Rubian quietly asked one of the maids whether the Duke had deliberately been avoiding meals with Boyd. The maid hesitated and gave no immediate answer. That silence alone made Rubian suspect that her guess was correct. A moment later, Hazel gently insisted that it was not exactly like that. She explained that the young master often suffered from stomach pains during meals, so they had gradually begun eating separately. According to her, when Boyd had first arrived at the castle, he had been terrified of the Duke. The Lord's strict demeanor had been intimidating to a child. In the past, Lady Rosetta had usually acted as a mediator between father and son, but she had become weak and often remained confined to her bed. Listening to this, Rubian realized that this must have happened shortly after the tragic loss of their unborn child, when grief had weighed heavily on the household. She suddenly told the maid that she no longer needed to go to the bathroom and that they should return. When she returned, Boyd greeted her with a cheerful smile. Rubian studied her brother thoughtfully before suggesting something unexpected. Perhaps they should invite their father to eat with them. Boyd stared at her in surprise. He had not expected such a proposal. Rubian asked whether he did not want to do it, or whether he was still afraid of the Duke. Boyd admitted that something unpleasant had happened between them before Rubian arrived, which was why their father still seemed strict with him. Rubian turned to the maid and asked whether the Duke truly had a lot of work that day. The maid confirmed that he did. At that moment, Rubian's lips slowly curled into a mischievous smile. Boyd shivered slightly when he saw the expression. For a brief moment, it looked as though a tiny devil had appeared before him. Some time later, while the Duke was working in his office, a knock sounded at the door. Without looking up, he sighed and told the visitor to leave the documents so he could review them later. However, when he finally raised his head, he froze in surprise. Standing in front of him was Rubian. The young girl greeted him politely and bowed deeply, asking for forgiveness in advance. The Duke looked at her in confusion, especially when he noticed the glasses she was wearing. He had no idea where she had found them. Without wasting any time, Rubian placed a thick folder of documents on his desk. The Duke examined it with confusion. Before he could ask any questions, Rubian calmly asked him to sign the documents. He looked through them briefly and realized that it was a complete contract. Slightly amused, he asked whether she had truly prepared everything herself. Rubian confirmed that she had. She also mentioned that a welcoming banquet was planned in his honor in the dining hall, and politely asked him to review the documents carefully and sign them. The Duke quickly noticed the clever trick she had arranged. Nevertheless, he signed the document with a faint smile. The child standing before him was clearly a clever little rascal. Rubian then pointed out that the signature also meant he had officially agreed to participate in the banquet. After saying this, she left the office with a satisfied expression. Soon afterward, Boyd eagerly asked whether her plan had worked. Rubian proudly declared that everything had gone perfectly. Both of them jumped happily with excitement. The maids soon began preparing for the banquet, each contributing something of their own. Decorations were arranged throughout the dining hall. Some of the preparations became surprisingly elaborate, but no one seemed to mind. Rubian watched the scene quietly. Seeing everyone working so hard for the celebration made her feel a little guilty. Boyd reassured her with a smile. The castle had not hosted such an event for a long time, so everyone was simply excited. During the preparations, the chef approached them warmly and asked Rubian what kind of cake she preferred. She was slightly surprised. After all, the celebration was meant for the Duke. Boyd explained that this did not mean she should be excluded from enjoying it. Rubian admitted shyly that she knew very little about desserts. In both of her lives, she had rarely had the chance to taste cakes, so she had no real preferences. The chef laughed and decided that he would simply prepare several different cakes so they could all choose later. Eventually, the preparations were complete. The dining hall now looked like the setting for a grand banquet. When the Duke finally entered, he smiled faintly and commented that he had wondered why the castle had suddenly become so quiet. Now he understood that everyone had been busy creating such a beautiful scene. Without hesitation, they took him by the arm and led him to the dining hall. Soon the Duke found himself seated at the place of honor. However, he looked slightly confused, believing that the true star of the celebration was Rubian. Rubian smiled at Boyd and encouraged him to explain everything. Gathering his courage, Boyd approached his father and sincerely expressed how relieved he was that the Duke had returned home safely. He explained that he had not had the opportunity to say this earlier, which was why he wanted to hold a small welcoming party. He thanked his father for everything he had done for the family, and admitted that he was genuinely happy that his father was alive and well. The Duke listened quietly, clearly moved by the heartfelt words. He gently placed a hand on Boyd's head in gratitude. At that moment, Rubian ran toward them and stared sharply at her brother, warning him not to add anything unnecessary. But Boyd, emboldened by the moment, suddenly declared that he was no longer afraid of his father. He had finally begun to understand why the Duke had acted the way he did. Rubian stepped beside him and lightly held his arm for support. Boyd glanced at her, then turned back toward the Duke. With a slightly embarrassed expression, he asked whether they could all start eating together from now on. Rubian watched the Duke carefully, hoping he would agree. Leviathan looked at his son with a quiet smile. In that moment, he realized that Boyd had grown and matured far more than he had expected. Leviathan smiled warmly. Boyd immediately grew embarrassed by the attention. With an awkward smile, he admitted that the idea had not truly been his. According to him, the plan had been Rubian's, and therefore the Duke should be praising the younger one instead. Rubian was caught completely off guard by the confession. She had not expected Boyd to expose her so easily. Then, with a mischievous tone, he told Boyd to catch the younger one and make Rubian the true star of the banquet. Boyd immediately agreed with a grin and rushed after Rubian. Startled, she quickly tried to escape, shouting that he was a traitor for exposing her like that. Yet even while complaining, she could see how much fun her brother was having. Their laughter echoed through the hall until the chef finally stepped out and reminded them to be careful. He gently invited them back to the table. Rubian looked around in mild confusion. She had always assumed the Duke would be the main guest of the evening, yet the celebration somehow felt like it revolved around her, almost like her own birthday party. Meanwhile, the maids happily folded small party hats and continued decorating the table, clearly enjoying the lively atmosphere. After the long day of planning and excitement, Rubian eventually became too tired. At some point during the banquet, she quietly fell asleep. Later, she slowly woke up and realized she was being carried on someone's back. It was the Duke. Leviathan smiled slightly and remarked that the child must have been exhausted after organizing the celebration all day. With quiet sincerity, he thanked Rubian for giving the castle such a joyful evening.